Well, the Iran war is now becoming entangled with the broader power struggle between Washington and Beijing, with China increasingly positioning itself at the centre of efforts to limit the fallout from the conflict. Beijing is Iran's biggest economic lifeline. Before the war, China bought most of Iran's sanctioned oil, helping to keep Tehran's economy afloat. Well, Iran's top diplomat, Abbas Araghchi, was in Beijing on Wednesday, seeking China's continuing support as Iran finds itself under increasing international pressure to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to stabilise global energy markets. Beijing will host the other side in this conflict next week when Donald Trump arrives for talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The Trump administration has been urging China to use its influence with Iran to help defuse tensions in the Gulf.
China always believes that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Middle Eastern and Gulf countries should be effectively respected, and civilians and non-military targets should be protected. The urgent task is to immediately implement a comprehensive ceasefire to prevent the spread of war.
So what does China want from this conflict, and could the Iran war ultimately shift the balance of power between Washington and Beijing? Kelly Grieco is a senior fellow at the Reimagining US Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. She's a military and security analyst with a focus on the Indo-Pacific. Welcome to the day. Let's start with yesterday's meeting between the Iranian and Chinese foreign minister. President Trump is due there in a week. Has China picked a side in this war?
Effectively, yes. They picked the Chinese side for sure. What I think we're seeing is they're clearly supporting Iran to an extent. Diplomatically, they're providing cover for Iran. There's reports that they're continuing to provide dual-use components for their drones. But they're also walking a fine line here, and that they've also signaled there are limits to Chinese support. For example, today, the announcement that they've told banks not to provide new loans to Iranian oil facilities. So clearly aligning themselves more with Iran, but walking a fine line.
And for all Beijing's talk through this war about de-escalation and diplomacy and the need for stability, is China quietly benefiting from this war?
It clearly is. I do think that actually Iran, China would like actually for this war to be over. It is economically exposed. They have deep oil reserves, but that doesn't last forever. And generally, the Chinese, don't like this kind of instability in places. But they are clearly benefiting from it. And I think you see this, quite a bit even in the Indo-Pacific itself, because, Asian allies and partners are being hard hit by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And while China announced a ban on exports of oil early in this conflict, it's actually not a complete ban. And what we've seen is that they've been doling out favors, if you will, to countries where they have improved relations, like Vietnam and Australia, providing some measure of relief to those countries. So positioning itself in many regards as a constructive player, and also a country that has some solutions to this kind of pain.
And as it sort of sits back and watches these two sides knock lumps out of each other, I wonder about the lessons that Beijing is taking from this war when it comes to Taiwan and future US military capacity.
Yes, clearly they're learning quite a bit. I will just say what's important here is that it's validating actually a lot of what the Chinese already thought about U.S. military vulnerabilities. If you look at Chinese military writings, they talk extensively about the vulnerability of U.S. air bases, about the critical enablers that for American air power, things like aerial refueling tankers, early warning aircraft. And they're well aware of the limits on U.S. interceptors and long-range munitions. And so all the things that they've designed their military strategy to exploit against the United States in a potential, confrontation over Taiwan, they're seeing lots of validation of that in terms of Iran's success against the United States. So I think it will bolster their confidence in their own strategy.
And equally, this war has forced Gulf states to reassess their security alliances. What initially was thought to be an advantage of having America cast its blanket over them has turned out to be not such a good thing, given that that's made them targets for Iran. What role might China have in the post-war regional order?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think what we're going to see is going to need to be a need for real significant rebuilding in some of these countries. Certainly, infrastructure that's been hard hit. And I think you'll see certainly a role in Chinese firms in trying to win some of those contracts. But I think the bigger question that you're really asking here is, will some of these Gulf states decide that, the United States is not a reliable strategic partner, doesn't want the United States, U.S. bases on their soil, and maybe replace the United States with China and Chinese security guarantees? I don't think that's actually what these countries will seek. I don't think they want to replace one set of problems with another. I think they're going to try to be more strategically independent. But I would also just say that there's no indication that China really wants to play that role in the region. In some respects, they're smarter than the United States, and that they're careful to not put them themselves in a position where they might get entangled in Middle East conflicts.
It's really interesting, that, isn't it? If you sort of take a gross look at it, on the one hand, you might say America is there flying the flag and saying, we lead the world, whereas China is sort of sitting back, letting them get on with it and quietly doing its bit to lead the bit of the world that it wants to lead without making a great big song and dance about it.
Absolutely. And in doing it in a way that they're not necessarily going to, pay high costs if they fail. So I think it's been interesting in the last week, for example, we've seen the Iranians have gone to Beijing to try to shore up diplomatic support. And at the same time, we've seen the administration very publicly now trying to put on pressure to Beijing to be a constructive actor to make the Iranians more reasonable at the negotiating table. So in other words, everyone's trying to curry favor with Beijing to try to facilitate these kinds of negotiations. And so it's really setting up the Chinese to position themselves as the more responsible regional actor that's trying to promote a return to peace and stability.
Okay, so has this war also strengthened China's hand in the Indo-Pacific? Are there benefits to China in drawing out the conflict, perhaps?
Yes, for sure. I mean, there are a few, I think, big ones here. One, of course, is that the United States has expended a lot of military capability, particularly on munitions and interceptors in the Middle East that are now not available for any kind of contingency in the Indo-Pacific. And that is going to take years to be able to rebuild those stockpiles we went through, which frankly weakens U.S. deterrence in the Indo-Pacific in the years ahead. And so that is certainly a big one. The second I would just say is what we talked about earlier about Gulf states finding that having U.S. bases on their soil makes them a target. You'd have to think that some allies and partners have watched that with concern. And thinking about if there is, let's say, a Taiwan contingency, whether they will also find themselves in the crosshairs receiving Chinese attacks because they host U.S. forces. And, I've seen even some writings out of the Philippines expressing this kind of concern. And so something that the Chinese can certainly exploit. And then I'll just say the third one, I think, is just certainly that the more the U.S. is seen as the party that is challenging the existing order, flouting the rules and the norms, the criticism and the spotlight is on the United States and not on China for its own behavior, which creates space for them in the region.
OK, so if we think ahead then to Donald Trump's impending visit to Beijing next week, how much has this war shifted the dynamic between these two rivals? Has it exposed or created strengths or weaknesses on either side?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, I think if it is the case that the president is going to Beijing next week and there isn't some kind of framework agreement, something on the table that sort of indicates that there could be a real serious diplomatic solution to the Middle East, he's going to be going there looking for Chinese help. And that shifts the dynamic. The Chinese may offer that kind of help, but they're going to want concessions and significant concessions. And I will just say that the other part of this is that the United States, the administration is distracted. There's no way around that. And so coming into this high-stakes summit that was supposed to be very important, it's being overshadowed by U.S. actions in the Middle East. And so the degree to which the administration has been able to focus on preparing for this summit, making sure it's successful, it has to have necessarily been reduced.
Thank you for talking us through that so clearly. Kelly Grieco from the Stimson Center. Thank you.
Thank you.